It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. The air was cool and quiet, and the sky had a soft glow from the setting sun. He walked along the small path through the woods just like he had done many times before. It was a peaceful shortcut he often took after work, a way to clear his mind before going home. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the sound of leaves crunching under his shoes felt familiar and calming. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first, but then in the distance something faint broke the silence. At first he thought it was the wind. Then he stopped walking and listened carefully. There it was again, a soft, shaky sound. It didn't take long for him to realize it wasn't the wind at all. It sounded like someone crying, a small, weak cry. He frowned, trying to figure out where it was coming from. He turned his head, listening again. The cry came from deeper inside the woods, away from the path. He hesitated for a moment. It was already getting darker, and the woods weren't exactly a place people liked to wander into at night. But something inside him wouldn't let him walk away. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a baby. His heart started to beat a little faster as he stepped off the path. Dry branches cracked under his shoes as he carefully moved through the bushes. The cry grew louder the closer he got. He called out softly, unsure of what to expect, but there was no answer. The sound of crying became clearer now, fragile and desperate. After a few more steps, he finally saw something that made his whole body freeze. Right there, near a thick tree trunk, was a tiny bundle wrapped in a thin old cloth. His eyes widened as the cry came from that very bundle. He dropped to his knees, his hands shaking slightly. As he gently pulled the cloth aside, his breath caught in his chest. It was a newborn baby. The baby's tiny face was red from crying, and the little hands moved weakly in the air. The cloth around the baby was damp and dirty, and the ground beneath was cold. The baby was shivering. In that moment, everything else around him disappeared. The trees, the darkness, the quiet. All he could hear was the soft cry of a helpless life lying on the forest floor. He looked around quickly, hoping to see someone nearby. Maybe a parent, maybe someone who needed help. But the woods were silent. There was no one there. His chest tightened as the reality hit him. This child had been left here, alone. His hands moved gently as he lifted the baby into his arms. The little body was so small and so light that it almost didn't feel real. He carefully wrapped the cloth tighter, trying to give some warmth. The baby let out another weak cry, and he whispered softly, trying to calm it down. He wasn't sure what to say, but his voice came out warm and steady. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe now. I've got you." He stood up, holding the baby close to his chest. The chill of the night made him move faster. He stepped back through the bushes and onto the path, his mind racing with thoughts. How long had the baby been here? Who could do something like this? But he pushed those questions aside for now. The only thing that mattered was getting help. His hands were shaking as he pulled his phone from his pocket. He dialed emergency services, his voice trembling but clear as he explained the situation. They told him to stay where he was and that help was on the way. He couldn't just stand still, though. He kept pacing on the path, gently rocking the baby in his arms. He whispered soft words, hoping the little one would feel less alone. The minutes felt like hours. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he kept looking down at the baby's face. The crying grew softer now, not because the baby was calm, but because it was tired. That scared him even more. The tiny hands moved weakly, and he held the child closer, sharing whatever little warmth he could. Finally, in the distance, he heard the sound of sirens. Red and blue lights flickered through the trees as a small ambulance and a police car arrived on the road nearby. He hurried toward the flashing lights, careful not to jostle the baby. 2 paramedics ran toward him, their faces changing the moment they saw what he was carrying. He quickly explained everything: how he had heard the cry, how he found the baby near the tree, how there was no one else around. The paramedics wrapped the baby in a warm, thick blanket and checked its breathing. One of them nodded slowly, saying in a calm but serious voice that the baby was cold but still alive. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. His hands were empty now, but they still felt the warmth and weight of the tiny child he had been holding. The police asked him a few quick questions, and though his answers were simple, his voice shook slightly. He was still trying to process what had just happened. The ambulance doors closed with a soft thud as they rushed the baby to the hospital. He stood there on the side of the road for a moment, the flashing lights reflecting on his face. The woods that usually felt so peaceful now seemed different. darker, heavier, a place where something unthinkable had just happened. He could have gone home at that moment. He could have walked away and left everything to the authorities. But something inside him wouldn't let him. He felt a strange pull, a connection he couldn't explain. This wasn't just a random event. He had found that child, and now he needed to know if it was going to be okay. He got into his old car and started the engine. The night was getting colder, but he didn't care. He followed the ambulance all the way to the hospital. He didn't know what he would say when he got there. He didn't even know why he felt so strongly, but he knew he had to go. When he arrived, the hospital lobby was bright and busy. Nurses and doctors moved quickly through the halls. He walked to the reception desk and told them what had happened. They nodded and said the baby was in the emergency room being checked by doctors. He sat down on a hard chair in the waiting area. His hands still felt warm from holding the baby. He stared at the floor, trying to replay the whole moment in his head. The cry in the woods, the tiny face, the cold air. It didn't feel real, yet every detail was sharp in his memory. A nurse came out after a while. She smiled softly and said the baby was stable, cold and weak but alive. If he hadn't found it when he did, things could have gone very differently. He felt a wave of relief rush through his chest. His shoulders finally relaxed a little. He didn't know why, but tears welled up in his eyes. He quickly wiped them away, embarrassed, but the nurse only gave him a kind look. As he sat there, people passed by. Nurses, patients, families. But all he could think about was that small, fragile life out there in the woods left to face the cold. And then the fact that it was safe now. He had done something good without even planning to. His phone buzzed with messages from friends asking where he was, but he didn't reply. He didn't want to leave. Somehow it felt wrong to walk away after what had happened. He didn't know what would happen to the baby next, but he knew this moment would stay with him forever. Later that night, as the doctors worked inside, the story began to spread quickly. One of the paramedics had quietly told the nurses what happened, and soon the hospital staff were whispering about the man who found a newborn crying in the woods. But to him it wasn't about being a hero. He didn't feel like one. He just happened to be there. And maybe that was enough. He stepped outside for a moment to breathe in the cold air. The night was silent again, but it felt different now. The same woods that once felt like just a quiet shortcut now felt like the place where something truly life-changing had happened. Not just for the baby, but for him too. Inside, a small, fragile life was fighting to stay warm, to keep breathing. And outside, a man who had simply followed a sound was realizing that sometimes a single choice can change everything. He didn't know what the future would bring. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of a story that would go far beyond the quiet woods. The night seemed endless as he waited in the hospital lobby. Every time the door to the emergency room opened, his heart jumped, hoping to see the tiny baby safe and breathing. Time moved slowly and his mind kept going back to the woods. He remembered the cold air, the thin cloth, the helpless cry. How had someone left a newborn out there all alone? The thought made him shiver even in the warmth of the hospital. Finally, a doctor came out. She had a calm but serious expression and held a small chart in her hands. "The baby is stable now," she said, "but it was very close. The child is cold, weak, and dehydrated. We'll keep monitoring, but thanks to you, the baby is alive." He nodded, trying to hold back the emotions that welled up in his chest. Relief washed over him, but there was also a lingering fear. The thought of what could have happened if he hadn't followed the sound of crying made him shiver again. He realized just how fragile life could be. The doctors and nurses moved quickly, preparing a warm crib and giving the baby fluids. He watched from a distance, not wanting to disturb the professionals, yet feeling a strange bond with this tiny human. It was as if the baby already knew he had saved its life. Every tiny breath seemed miraculous, every faint movement precious. Soon, the hospital staff started asking questions. Who was he? How did he find the baby? He explained quietly, trying to be brief. They listened with wide eyes, impressed but also shocked. Finding a newborn abandoned in the woods was rare, almost unbelievable. Some of the nurses murmured to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief. He stayed quiet, letting the professionals do their work, but inside, he felt something he couldn't describe. A mix of responsibility, fear, and hope. Outside the hospital, news began to spread. A nurse had quietly shared the story with a local reporter. Soon, The small town was buzzing with whispers about the man who found a baby in the middle of the woods. People called him a hero, but he didn't feel like one. He had simply heard a cry and followed it. Anyone could have done the same. Hours passed and the night grew deeper. He stayed in the waiting area, unable to leave. His phone was full of messages from friends and family who had heard the news. They asked if he was okay, if the baby was safe. He replied slowly, carefully, explaining that the baby was alive and stable but still in the hospital. He didn't know how to explain the strange mix of fear and connection he felt. Finally, the nurse came out again. "Would you like to see the baby?" she asked gently. He nodded and she led him to a small room where the tiny child lay, wrapped in a soft, warm blanket. The baby's eyes were closed, the chest rising and falling steadily. The little hands twitched occasionally, and he could see the faintest sign of a smile as the baby shifted in the warmth. His heart swelled. Seeing the baby like this, alive and breathing, made every moment in the woods feel even more vivid. He remembered the cold night, the shivering, the fear that had gripped him. But now, seeing the baby safe, it felt like a miracle. He whispered softly, "You're safe now. You're going to be okay." The nurse left him alone for a few minutes. He stayed there, watching the tiny chest rise and fall, feeling the warmth that came from just being close. He thought about how fragile life could be, and how one person's action could make the difference between life and death. He had found the baby, and now it was alive because of him. That thought stayed with him, heavy and beautiful all at once. Meanwhile, the authorities began their investigation. Police officers came to the hospital, asking questions about where he had found the child, what time it happened, and if he had noticed anything unusual in the area. He answered everything carefully, trying to remember every detail: the sound of the cry, the location near the tree, the thin cloth, and the silence that surrounded him. The police took notes and promised to search the woods thoroughly for any clues. They wanted to find out who could leave a newborn alone and why. He listened quietly, feeling a mixture of hope and dread. Part of him wanted to know the story behind this abandonment, but another part worried about the truth. He hoped it was not something tragic, but deep down he feared it might be. Hours later, a doctor came to give an update. "The baby is gaining strength," she said with a small smile. "We're giving fluids and keeping the baby warm. Once stable, we'll run more tests to ensure everything is okay." He nodded, feeling a sense of relief that was hard to put into words. He stayed close, almost unwilling to leave. Each breath the baby took felt like a tiny victory, each small movement a sign of life fighting against impossible odds. As the night turned to early morning, the hospital quieted down. Nurses and doctors moved efficiently, but the pace slowed. He sat in the waiting area, reflecting on everything that had happened. The woods, the cry, the shivering baby, the warmth of holding the tiny body. It felt like a lifetime in just a few hours. He realized that he would never forget this night, no matter how long he lived. By morning, news of the baby's rescue had reached the wider community. People were leaving messages of support and gratitude for the man who found the child. Some wanted to know his name. Some wanted to know how the baby was doing. Social media posts and local news stories began spreading, painting him as a hero. He felt uncomfortable with the attention. To him, it wasn't about praise, it was about saving a life. Yet even with the attention, he felt a strange calm. The baby was safe, the doctors were taking care of it, and authorities were investigating. He realized that sometimes life could change in an instant, and sometimes ordinary people could find themselves in extraordinary situations. He had gone for a quiet walk, expecting nothing, and instead had found a life depending entirely on his actions. Later that day, the hospital staff prepared to transfer the baby to a secure room for ongoing care. He followed quietly, watching as the tiny being was settled into a crib. The warmth of the blanket and the gentle hum of the machines made the baby seem peaceful, almost like nothing had happened. But he knew better. He remembered the cold woods, the shivering, and the tiny cry that had called him to action. As he left the hospital, he felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and peace. He had been through a night of fear, responsibility, and hope. And while the investigation and the questions would continue, the most important thing was done. The baby was alive. He knew that the story didn't end here. There would be more challenges ahead, more questions, and more decisions. But for now, the tiny life he had found in the woods was safe, and that was enough to carry him through the day. Even after he returned home, The memory stayed with him. The image of the baby's tiny hands, the fragile cries, the cold night, it all replayed in his mind. It was a reminder of how quickly life could change, and how important even small actions could be. That night in the woods would stay with him forever, a story of fear, courage, and the fragile beauty of life. And while the world would soon hear about the baby and the man who found it, for him, it was more than a story. It was a moment that changed him, a moment that reminded him that kindness, courage, and quick action could save lives in ways no one expected. The days after the baby was found passed in a blur. The hospital staff worked tirelessly, checking every detail of the child's health. He kept visiting, not because anyone asked him to, but because he felt a strange connection that he couldn't explain. Every time he saw the baby wrapped in soft blankets and lying in the crib, he felt a mix of relief, awe, and worry. The little life that had been abandoned in the cold woods was now slowly growing stronger. Meanwhile, the authorities continued their investigation. Police officers scoured the area near the woods looking for clues. They measured tire tracks in the mud, collected bits of fabric, and spoke to anyone who might have seen something unusual that night. They also checked nearby neighborhoods, asking if anyone had heard a baby crying or seen someone acting suspiciously. The man answered questions patiently, describing every detail he remembered. Every leaf, every shadow, every sound. It all seemed important to the police. Despite the ongoing investigation, the town couldn't stop talking about the story. Local news reporters visited the hospital, carefully asking questions without disturbing the baby. People called from nearby towns, sending messages of gratitude and support. Some even left small gifts at the hospital, tiny clothes, soft blankets, and notes of encouragement. The man couldn't believe how many strangers were touched by the story of a child abandoned and saved in the woods. One afternoon, a detective came to speak with him privately. The detective showed him a piece of torn fabric that had been found near the spot where the baby was discovered. "This might help us identify the person who left the baby," the detective said. The man studied it carefully. It looked old, frayed, and barely recognizable, but he remembered seeing something similar wrapped around the baby. Every small detail seemed to matter in unraveling the mystery. At the same time, the baby's condition improved. The tiny body, once so fragile, now moved a little more, opened its eyes for a few seconds, and made small cooing sounds. Each little movement felt miraculous. The man spent hours sitting nearby, softly talking to the baby. He couldn't help but imagine the life that could have been lost, and he felt grateful to have been in the right place at the right time. Days turned into a week, and the investigation began to reveal a few clues. Witnesses came forward. Some had seen a woman walking near the woods late at night carrying something small, hurried and tense. Others mentioned a car parked near the entrance, lights off, engine running. Each clue was a small piece of a larger puzzle. The authorities worked carefully, knowing that every detail could help find the person responsible for abandoning the baby. Despite all this, he didn't feel anger or judgment. Whenever he thought about the person who had left the child, he felt sadness instead. How desperate must someone have been to leave a newborn alone in the woods? How frightened, how lost, how hopeless. He couldn't imagine making such a choice, and yet he knew life could push people to unimaginable limits. His mind often wandered to the baby's perspective, cold, alone, and crying for someone to come. That thought made his heart ache. At the hospital, nurses noticed the connection between him and the child. Though he wasn't family, his visits were consistent, gentle, and patient. He spoke softly, soothed, and paid attention to every tiny detail of the baby's needs. Some staff quietly commented that it was as if he had been meant to find this child, as if fate had led him through the woods that night. And maybe in some way it had. Then came the first breakthrough in the investigation. A neighbor from several miles away reported seeing a young woman in distress, wandering near the woods with a small bundle. Her account matched the night the baby was found. Authorities began piecing together a timeline, tracking movements and trying to locate the woman. Every day brought new details, some small, some shocking. The man watched the progress quietly, unsure of how he would feel when the truth came out. Through it all, the baby continued to recover. Each tiny coo, each stretch of the hands, each blink of the eyes was a small celebration. He found himself smiling more than he expected. Every day the baby survived. Every hour it grew stronger, felt like a victory against a world that had once seemed so cruel to this tiny life. He talked softly to the child, promising safety, warmth, and care. Even if the investigation revealed heartbreaking truths, he would make sure the baby always felt love and protection. The town, too, was beginning to feel a mixture of emotions. The story was no longer just about a heroic act, it was about a mystery, about loss, desperation, and hope. Neighbors whispered about the clues, about the possibility of finding the woman who had left the child. People debated quietly, some angry, some sympathetic, but all deeply moved by the thought of a newborn surviving against the odds. The detective called him one evening with news. They had a lead that might identify the woman. They asked him to be patient and continue his visits, reassuring him that the baby would remain safe no matter what happened. He nodded, feeling a quiet weight in his chest. The end of the mystery was approaching, and he knew it might bring emotions he wasn't prepared for. But for now, the baby was safe, and he would focus on that. Evenings in the hospital became a routine. He would arrive, check on the baby, speak softly, and watch the tiny chest rise and fall. He remembered the night in the woods, the fear, the uncertainty, and he realized how quickly life could change. One moment he had been walking alone, expecting nothing, and the next he had held a life in his arms that depended entirely on him. That memory stayed with him every day, shaping his thoughts and guiding his actions. And then, a surprising moment came. The baby, who had once been so fragile and silent, let out a small, almost playful coo. His heart leapt. It was a sign of life, a sign that the tiny human he had found alone in the dark woods was beginning to respond to warmth, safety, and care. He whispered softly, smiling through the tears he tried to hide. "You're going to be okay," he said, and in that moment he felt the truth of those words more than ever. While the investigation moved forward and the town waited for answers, he realized something. This story wasn't just about finding a baby. It was about hope, courage, and connection. One cry in the darkness had led to a series of events that no one could have predicted. One person's choice to follow a sound had saved a life. And one tiny, fragile life was teaching a whole community about compassion, resilience, and the power of small, meaningful actions. The following days were filled with tense anticipation. The authorities had finally tracked down a young woman who seemed to match all the descriptions from witnesses and clues. She was brought in for questioning, and the story that unfolded was both heartbreaking and shocking. She appeared tired and frightened, her eyes red from crying. Her hands shook as she spoke, and her voice barely rose above a whisper. She told the investigators that she had recently faced a series of challenges no one could have prepared her for. She was alone, overwhelmed, and desperate. She hadn't known where to turn or whom to ask for help. That night, she said, she had made a decision she could never undo, leaving the baby in the woods. She hadn't meant to hurt the child, but fear and desperation had clouded her judgment. When the man heard the news, his heart twisted in ways he didn't expect. Anger or resentment could have come easily. Instead, all he felt was sadness. He imagined the fear, the panic, the helplessness she must have felt. She had been driven to an impossible situation, and the consequences were a tiny life left alone in the cold woods. His mind kept returning to the baby, shivering and crying, waiting for someone to come. The town reacted in mixed ways. Some were angry and wanted justice. Others were sympathetic, realizing that sometimes life's pressures push people to unimaginable limits. The man, however, felt something deeper. He realized that the story wasn't just about mistakes or blame. It was about life, chance, and the choices that define us. He knew that compassion could be more powerful than judgment. At the hospital, he continued visiting the baby, who was growing stronger each day. The child's tiny movements became more confident, the cries less desperate, and the eyes brighter. Nurses began noticing how the baby would calm down at his voice, how the little hands seemed to reach instinctively toward him. It was as if the child knew who had saved it, who had been there in the cold night when no one else could help. The authorities continued their work, but the man focused on what he could control, being present for the baby. He spent hours gently rocking, feeding, and talking. Even when news cameras and reporters tried to reach him, he stayed calm, always emphasizing the baby's well-being over his own recognition. He didn't seek praise. He wanted the child to feel safety and love, and nothing else mattered. Eventually, the woman's story went public, and the reaction of the man became a headline itself. People around the world were stunned, not by the crime but by the compassion he displayed. In interviews, he spoke not of anger or vengeance but of understanding. He spoke about how fear and desperation could drive anyone to unimaginable actions, and how responding with care could change everything. His words spread quickly, inspiring countless others. The woman, though facing legal consequences, expressed deep remorse. She asked if the baby would be okay, and quietly thanked the man who had found the child. It was a small, fragile moment of human connection, but it carried a weight that no one could ignore. The man simply nodded, feeling that in some way their lives had intersected for a reason. As the hospital days passed, the bond between the man and the baby grew stronger. The child, once alone and shivering, now reached out, grasping fingers and cooing at voices. Each small sign of trust and affection became a victory in a story that had begun with fear and uncertainty. He realized that what started as a terrifying night in the woods had transformed into hope, love, and a second chance for a life that could have been lost. The world watched and waited, fascinated by the story of survival, compassion, and unexpected connections. And though he had been an ordinary man walking home through the woods, his courage and empathy had become extraordinary. He had turned a moment of fear into a lifetime of change, proving that sometimes the right choice is simply to act, even when the outcome is unknown. Even as legal processes continued, even as questions were asked and answers sought, one truth remained clear. The baby was alive, safe, and beginning to thrive. And the man who had followed the cry in the dark night would forever be a part of that child's life. A symbol of hope, courage, and the power of kindness in a world that often seems cold and indifferent. Weeks passed, and the baby grew stronger each day. The tiny cries that had first echoed through the cold woods were now soft, happy coos. The medical team at the hospital was amazed at how resilient the child had become. Every day brought small milestones. Lifting a hand, turning the head, opening the eyes wide with curiosity. Each movement reminded everyone how fragile life could be, yet how powerful the will to survive was. The man continued visiting daily, never missing a single day. His connection with the child had deepened into something that could not be described in words. He fed the baby, held the baby, and whispered stories in a gentle voice. The child began to recognize him, calming instantly whenever he appeared. It was as if the bond they had formed that night in the woods could not be broken, a connection forged through fear, courage, and care. Meanwhile, the authorities concluded their investigation. The young woman who had left the baby, though facing consequences for her actions, had expressed deep remorse. She acknowledged that she had been lost, scared, and desperate, and the world learned that her story, though tragic, was also a reminder of how people sometimes make choices they never intended to make. The man had long ago decided to approach the situation with compassion rather than judgment, and his calm, empathetic response became a model for others. The story of the baby and the man who had found it began to spread far beyond the town. People everywhere were touched by the tale of survival, hope, and unexpected heroism. Messages of support, letters, and small gifts arrived at the hospital from strangers inspired by the story. Yet the man remained focused on the most important thing, the child's safety, comfort, and love. Recognition was never the goal. The goal had always been the simple act of saving a life. Eventually, the authorities and the hospital agreed that the baby would need a permanent home. After careful consideration, the man decided to step forward. He applied to become the child's foster parent. It wasn't an easy process. There were forms, checks, and long days of waiting, but he was determined. He wanted to provide the love, care, and stability the baby deserved. After several weeks, the application was approved. The baby was placed in his care permanently. The little life that had begun in fear and uncertainty now had a home filled with warmth, safety, and love. The man, once just a passerby who had heard a cry in the woods, became the child's guardian and protector. It was a role he had never anticipated, yet one that felt perfectly natural. Years later, the child grew up surrounded by love, care, and guidance. Though he was too young to remember the night in the woods, the man often told the story gently, emphasizing the importance of compassion, courage, and empathy. The child learned that life can be fragile, that small acts of courage can change everything, and that love often comes from unexpected places. The man never forgot the night he found the baby. The memory of the cold woods, The soft cries and the tiny shivering body stayed with him forever. He understood that life could change in an instant, and that sometimes one person's choice could alter the course of someone else's destiny entirely. The world, too, remembered. The story of the abandoned baby and the man who saved it became a symbol of hope and humanity. It reminded people that even in the darkest moments, kindness and courage can shine through. One small act, one decision to follow a sound in the night, had saved a life and inspired countless others to act with compassion in their own lives. In the end, the man and the child were more than just survivor and rescuer. They became a family, bound together not by chance but by a profound moment of courage and care. A life that had begun in fear and uncertainty now thrived, surrounded by love, safety, and hope. And the man who had simply followed a cry in the woods proved that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they act with their hearts. Years went by, and the child grew into a lively, curious, and joyful little person. The memories of that terrifying night in the woods were far away, but the lessons from it lived on in small ways. The man who had once been a stranger walking home had become the center of the child's world, a steady, caring presence who taught love, kindness, and courage through every action. Every morning, the child would greet him with a wide smile, tiny hands reaching out instinctively. The man would scoop the child up, feeling the same warmth he had felt all those years ago holding a shivering newborn in the darkness. The bond was stronger than ever, forged in fear, strengthened by care, and maintained through daily acts of love. The town never forgot the story either. What had begun as a shocking headline about an abandoned baby had become a story about hope, second chances, and human compassion. Teachers, neighbors, and friends would often mention it to the child, reminding them that life could change in an instant, and that small acts of courage could leave lasting ripples. As the child learned to walk, to speak, and to explore the world, the man taught lessons not through lectures but through example. He showed the child how to help others, how to notice when someone was in need, and how kindness often mattered more than recognition. Every time the child laughed or discovered something new, he remembered that life, fragile and precious, was worth protecting, and that one person could make a real difference. Even as the child grew older, questions naturally arose. "Why did someone leave me in the woods?" the child asked one evening. The man took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people make mistakes," he said softly. "They get scared, they get lost, or they don't know what to do. But what matters is that you are here now, safe and loved, and that you have the power to make choices that help others too." The child listened quietly, understanding in their own way. That story became part of their life, a reminder of survival, compassion, and the importance of courage in moments of uncertainty. And though the past could never be changed, the future was full of possibilities. In time, the man and the child would walk through parks, woods, and quiet paths together, telling stories, discovering nature, and sharing laughter. Every step was a celebration of life, a life that had started with fear and danger, but now blossomed into hope and joy. The story of that night in the woods, the cry that had led to action, and the fragile newborn who had survived against all odds became more than a memory. It became a living lesson that courage, kindness, and compassion can transform lives, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that love can grow from the most unlikely beginnings. And so, years after that cold night, both lives continued forward, forever connected, forever changed, and forever proof that even in darkness, hope can shine brighter than anyone ever imagined. Years had passed since that cold night in the woods. The tiny newborn who had once shivered in fear was now a lively child full of energy, curiosity, and laughter. The bond between the man and the child had only grown stronger over time. He had become more than a rescuer. He was a parent, a guardian, and a constant source of love and guidance. Every morning the child would run into his arms with a wide smile, and every evening they would fall asleep with a sense of safety and warmth that had been missing on that first night. The man often thought back to that night. The cry in the darkness, the chill of the forest, the small life in his hands. It had been terrifying, uncertain, and overwhelming, yet it had also been life-changing. It had shown him how fragile life could be, and how one person's quick action could save a life forever. He realized that moment had not only saved the child but had changed him as well, teaching patience, empathy, and the importance of acting with a compassionate heart. The child grew up hearing the story of that night, Told gently in small pieces enough to understand without being frightened, they learned that life can be unpredictable, that people sometimes make mistakes, and that courage and kindness can overcome fear. The man emphasized that every person has the ability to make a difference no matter how small the action might seem. The child listened intently, absorbing these lessons as a foundation for their own life. Life outside the hospital also moved on. The town remembered the story, celebrating the man's bravery and the child's survival as a symbol of hope. Teachers, neighbors, and friends would occasionally remind the child of how far they had come. Though the past could not be changed, everyone around celebrated the future that had been saved, the life that had been nurtured and protected. Despite all odds, as the years continued, the man and the child created new memories together, exploring parks, learning to ride bicycles, sharing stories, and discovering the world hand in hand. Every milestone the child achieved reminded the man of the resilience and courage that had been present from the very beginning. He often marveled at how something so small and fragile had grown into a strong, joyful little person full of potential. The story of the baby in the woods, the desperate situation, and the man who had found them became a lesson that transcended a single event. It became a story of hope, compassion, and the enduring power of human connection. The child, though too young to remember the fear and loneliness of that first night, carried the lessons of courage, kindness, and resilience into their own life, shaping the person they were becoming. Even as the man grew older and the child matured, the memory of that night remained vivid. It was a reminder that life can change in an instant, that one act of bravery can save a life, and that love and care can transform even the most desperate situations. Together they lived as proof that hope, empathy, and courage are more powerful than fear, and that ordinary people can perform extraordinary acts when they follow their hearts. And so, years after that cold night in the woods, both the man and the child moved forward, forever connected, forever changed, and forever proof that even in the darkest moments, hope and love can shine brighter than anyone ever imagined. Years after the night in the woods, life had grown calmer yet fuller for both the man and the child. The child had grown from a fragile, shivering newborn into a curious, lively kid with wide eyes and endless questions. Every day brought new discoveries, and every night brought comfort and warmth, the exact opposite of that first terrifying evening. But even as life seemed ordinary, the memory of the baby's rescue and the journey that followed remained a quiet, guiding force in both their lives. School became a new world for the child, filled with friends, learning, and adventures. The man attended parent-teacher meetings, helped with homework, and listened patiently to stories about the child's day. He marveled at how much life had changed from that one night in the woods. The child, now full of laughter and energy, had no memory of being alone or abandoned, yet the lessons from the past were woven into their upbringing in subtle ways: gratitude, empathy, and understanding that life is fragile but precious. The man often told stories, not of fear, but of courage, resilience, and kindness. He spoke about the night in the woods, carefully avoiding anything frightening, focusing instead on the idea that one act of care could change everything. The child learned that even small gestures, small decisions, and small moments of bravery could leave lasting marks on the world. One person's choice can save a life, he would say. You never know when someone might need you, or when you might be the reason someone survives. The child grew curious about the wider world. They asked questions about the town, about people who had helped them, and about the life they might have had if the man had not followed the cries. The man answered carefully, explaining that some stories begin with darkness, but they don't have to end there. What mattered was what came next, the love, care, and attention that followed. The child learned that their life had been a miracle, but that miracles sometimes need people willing to act. Outside their home, the town continued to follow the story. The man had long since become a quiet local hero, not seeking praise, but always quietly helping when someone needed it. Stories of the child's survival and the man's courage had inspired other acts of kindness in the community. People volunteered at shelters, helped families in need, and paid attention to neighbors who might be struggling. The baby in the woods had grown into a symbol, not just of survival, but of the ripple effect of compassion. As the child grew older, they began to understand the depth of the story. It wasn't just about being found or saved. It was about choices, responsibility, and the courage to act even when the outcome was uncertain. The child developed a strong sense of empathy, noticing when someone was sad, lonely, or struggling. They volunteered at local events, helped younger children at school, and even raised small funds for families who were in difficult situations. The man watched quietly, proud and amazed at how a single act of compassion had seeded a whole life dedicated to kindness. One afternoon, as the child sat reading in their room, they asked a question that took the man by surprise. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't gone into the woods that night?" The man paused for a moment, thinking back to the cold, dark trees, the tiny body, and the helpless cries. He swallowed hard and said, "I try not to think about it. But I know this. That night taught me something important. Life is unpredictable, and sometimes we are given chances to do the right thing. That's all we can do. Choose to act with courage and kindness when the moment comes." The child nodded thoughtfully, understanding in a way that felt older than their years. They realized that the story wasn't just about a baby in danger. It was about human responsibility, about noticing when someone needs help, and about the power each person carries to change a life. They carried that lesson forward every day in school, in friendships, and even in quiet moments at home. The man also noticed changes in himself. He had once been an ordinary person, walking home through familiar woods, unaware that a single decision would change his life forever. But now he understood that life's extraordinary moments often arrive without warning. Courage, he realized, wasn't about being fearless. It was about acting despite fear. Compassion wasn't about fame. It was about giving attention, care, and love when it was most needed. The child's life was proof that both courage and compassion mattered more than anything else. One summer evening, the two of them walked together near the same woods where it all began. The trees were taller now, the path familiar yet transformed by years of growth. The man told the child stories about the forest, not about fear, but about listening, noticing, and understanding the world around them. "Sometimes a sound, a movement, or a small cry can change everything," he said. "You have to be ready to respond. You have to be brave enough to act." The child listened closely, absorbing every word. They looked at the trees, imagining the night when their life had been so fragile, and they understood, perhaps for the first time, just how much courage it had taken for someone to find them. Their hearts swelled with gratitude, not just for the man, but for the life they now had, the opportunities, the safety, and the love that had replaced fear and loneliness. As the years continued, the child's life blossomed. They excelled in school, nurtured friendships, and discovered talents in art, music, and sports. The man supported every step, always present, always steady, guiding without controlling, loving without needing recognition. The bond between them was unbreakable, built not only on the night in the woods but on countless daily moments of care, laughter, and shared experiences. Occasionally, the story of the baby in the woods returned to the news, or someone from the town would remind them of it. The child, now older, felt a sense of pride and purpose, realizing that their life had become a living example of hope. People often asked the man how the child had turned out so well, and he would simply say they had a chance. They had care, love, and courage around them. That's all anyone needs to grow. One day, the child turned to the man and asked, "Do you think the world can be better if more people do small acts of kindness?" The man smiled softly. "Yes," he said. "Every act of care, every choice to help, every moment of courage adds up. You don't have to change the world in one day. Just change one life. And sometimes that one life can change the world around it." The child nodded, understanding that lesson deeply. They looked out at the forest, the same place where their life had begun in uncertainty, and felt a quiet gratitude. Life had offered a second chance, and now it was their turn to continue the story, to act with compassion, courage, and awareness in the world. Through these years, both lives had grown in ways that were impossible to measure. The man had found purpose and meaning, and the child had found love, safety, and the tools to become a kind, empathetic, and brave individual. The memory of that cold, dark night remained, but it was no longer a memory of fear. It was a memory of survival, hope, and transformation. The story of the baby in the woods had started with desperation and uncertainty, but it had grown into something much larger. A life saved, a bond formed, and a legacy of courage and kindness that would continue for years to come. And the child, once fragile and abandoned, now walked confidently into the world, carrying the lessons of love, bravery, and hope in their heart. The man and the child, connected forever by that single moment, continued their lives with gratitude, care, and a deep understanding that one action, one choice could change everything. And in that understanding, they found the quiet joy and strength that comes from knowing that even in the darkest moments, the light of courage and compassion can shine, guiding the way for years to come.